Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar in which we answer all your employment-related COVID questions and everything that entails. So first of all, let's do a few introductions. So today, I'm thankfully supported by Victoria Templeton, our HR Knowledge Manager, as well as Dom Greenwood, our Senior Health, Safety and Environment Management Consultant. So we're answering both health and safety and HR related questions today. I'm just here to facilitate it all, but we've also got in the background our team who's our technical support. So if you have any issues, do message us and we will try and answer them for you. So we're going to give you just a brief discussion about the current situation, and then we're going to launch into your questions. So the majority of the webinar will be covering all the questions that we've been sent in advance through the registration process. We still want to invite you to ask questions during the webinar, so if you have any supplemental ones or further thoughts, we have had to put you on mute. So the way that you do this is by going to your chat panel, and you should have something that looks a little bit like this. Please type your questions in the panel and send it to us, and then we will aim to try and deal with them at the end of the webinar, depending on how the time goes. If we don't get to all your questions during the webinar, then we will come back to you directly afterwards. So please don't feel ignored. It will depend on time, but we will try and get through as many as possible. We do want to still run a poll. We've only got one today, but we're going to have one shortly. So when it does appear on your screen, you'll get this slide. You will need to make sure your screen's not in full screen mode to be able to participate. Yes, hope you'll know about that as soon as it comes up. So just a reminder, we're going to look initially at an update on the current situation before we launch into all the questions. And I'm going to hand over to Victoria to take us through.
Thank you, Sue, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar today. So just to set the scene and the context for obviously the questions that we're going to be answering. So in recent months, we have seen the gradual reopening of all sectors of the economy, and we've seen schools and universities return. But as we enter the autumn, and as with lockdown measures having eased, we are actually now seeing an increase in the infection levels, and also we've seen several local lockdowns occur. We know that the government have announced the tightening up of lockdown measures, so there is potential for another national lockdown. Obviously, that's not at this stage. They're trying to avoid that by tightening up other measures, but that is something that we need to be mindful of. And of course, in the last week or so, we've seen new regulations coming into force that make self-isolation mandatory and a criminal offence if breached by both employer and employee. So we have a lot to deal with at this moment, along with the new test and trace app, which notifies people if they've been in contact with somebody who's tested positive. So these particular changes undoubtedly is going to lead to more absences from work. And we've also seen the change to the quarantine list occur quite frequently. So we have to also be mindful of countries that get added, get removed, because obviously the implications for employees coming back from holiday in terms of the need to quarantine and self-isolate. And in terms of support for business, we've also seen in recent weeks the announcement of a job retention bonus. We have the Kickstart Scheme to help with the recruitment of young people, and last week was the announcement of the new job support scheme. So there's been a few things that have occurred since we last did a COVID webinar, and hopefully this webinar is going to help answer many of those questions that you've all submitted to us. So I think we're going to now quickly do a poll and just see where things are at. So I'll hand over to Sue.
Okay, so yeah, this is the return poll we're doing today, and we are also experimenting, for those of you who've joined us before, and you should be able to select more than one answer. So let's see how that works. So I'm going to launch the poll now. So can see a number of you voting. Give it just a few more seconds. Nearly everybody's voted now, I think. Okay. I'll close that poll now. And I'll share the answers with you.
Ah, okay.
That's pretty evenly distributed as well.
It is, and I think it just reinforces what we already know, that it's a very challenging time all round, isn't it, for businesses and employees.
Yeah, there's many issues. Of course, I mean, our helpline is still, it's almost as busy as it was during the initial lockdown period, with all the challenges of trying to come back to work and deal with all the ever-changing government advice as well.
And I think the highest, the 47% answers there, I think we've not really experienced to date repeated self-isolation, because up to now it's been not mandatory, forced upon, and we've also not had that test and trace systems. But I think now we've got those mechanisms in place. I think, you know, we are going to see that as more of a challenge for business, the disruption of having to repeatedly self-isolate. So that'll be a challenge. Okay, thank you, Sue. Okay,
so I'll hide that poll, and we will move on to all of your lovely question and answers. So I think we've tried to collate them into sections so that there's a natural flow. And the first section that we're going to cover off is a COVID secure workplace. And that's sort of health and safety. So Dom's going to start us off, I think, with the questions. So let's move on to your first question, which was, can staff share toilet and washroom facilities? So Dom, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, morning everybody. Thanks for joining. Can staff share toilet and washroom facilities? Well, the answer is yes. It goes back to the coronavirus, COVID-19 risk assessment that you should have all done. And I'm hoping you have done that. And really what you need to do is decide whether you're going to open all of the toilets. It depends whether you've got 1, 2 or multiple toilets. You may have cubicle toilets, you may have washrooms on different levels. So really it needs to go back to your own business, because everybody's different, as you'll appreciate, and looking at a sensible, socially distanced way of kind of allowing staff to use them. I think one thing I would say is looking at an increased cleaning schedule around those areas as well. So whether you use a contract cleaner or whether you use an in-house cleaner, think about a more frequent approach to cleaning those areas, and maybe a one in, one out system as well. More than happy to take questions via email afterwards, and I can probably go into a bit more detail, but that is the way I'd approach that particular scenario.
Okay, thank you. And yes, as Dom said, we're trying to cover off as many questions as possible, so we will give as much info as we can, but if you do want more detail, please do message us separately and we will come back to you afterwards. So the next question is, can staff use the kitchen, and if so, how many at a time?
Okay, good question, and it's a similar response to the previous question. I'm working with a couple of clients at the moment. One of those has got a kitchen that would probably only fit 2 people in it anyway, and the other one has got a kitchen which would probably fit 15 people in. So it really depends on the size of your kitchen and whether or not you feel you can socially distance staff in there at any one time. My view would be that one or 2 would work, but any more than that, I would suggest that you'd want to socially distance. And again, look at the cleaning regime and maybe think about a rota system where people go in and do what they're doing. Maybe it's up to one person to use the kitchen and then change around. So all of it should be picked up in the COVID risk assessment. And if you haven't already done so, there's a couple of really good government documents available, which we can send you, or you can get those on the hse.org site, which is managing a secure workplace for SMEs, and quite a lot of these questions are explained.
Okay, thank you. And I guess it's also having lots of sanitizer about and cleaning materials.
Absolutely.
Everywhere you can in hot spots around the organisation. And posters.
You need posters.
We do need posters. It's that Don was putting posters up all around our business yesterday. Many of them that you would need a step ladder to reach, but that's another story. So what should we do if a member of staff comes to work displaying COVID symptoms?
Okay, so first of all, just because they are displaying COVID symptoms doesn't mean to say they've got COVID. There is a number of strands of common colds going around at the moment. I think quite a lot of people are naturally panicking and running off to get tests and everything else. So I think first of all, don't panic. I think talk to that person, socially distance, of course, to try and find out whether or not it could just be a common cold, because it could be their children have picked something up from school or whatever it might be. Probably suggest that they go home. I think that'd be wise, because it could obviously be coronavirus, COVID-19. And then really it's about them following the Public Health England guidance about maybe booking a test, registering their symptoms on the COVID-19 app, which if you guys haven't got that, it'd be certainly worth asking your staff to download that, because it's a wealth of information, but you can also upload symptoms, you can do a venue check-in, and it's a really good source of resource for those people. But I think over and above everything, don't panic, because I think we're still in such a fraught time, obviously, with potential further restrictions coming, and business owners are naturally worrying. What we don't want to do is be worrying the workforce, so there's panicking. So don't panic, talk to the person, try and find out some history. They can use the app, do so, but probably go home, self-isolate as well, and then really take it from there.
Okay, thank you. So what documents do we need to have in place before they can come back to work?
Okay, so you've probably heard me a couple of times already mention the COVID-19 risk assessment. There's a number out there, and there's a version of that on the HSE website. We've also got a free one you can download, which we can send out the links again after today. That's really the starting point, because what that will do is look at the business and get the competent person or health and safety manager or ops manager or whatever structure you've got to look at what risks there are in reopening the workplace and allowing staff back in again. There's also a self-assessment guide, and again, we've got that available, where you would go through a number of points, really, and it's red, amber, green, to see what you've got in place currently, what you haven't got in place, and what control measures you need to put in place to make sure that the business is COVID secure. In addition, as I said earlier, there is a PDF guidance booklet which you can download, and in there is the COVID secure method statement poster that you can download and display on your front door, reception area, whatever it might be, to give customers, staff, visitors the confidence to access the facility. In addition, there is now the QR code, which you can also display, which is linked to the NHS app, which again I would advise everybody to do for the reasons we've already talked about. I would also think about check sheets, and again, a number of businesses will be using daily, weekly and monthly check sheets that maybe staff will be operating before the business opens. But again, I would have a COVID section on there, so that we can make sure, as Sue said earlier, sanitizers in place, signage is in place, directional signage is in place, everybody knows what they're doing, social distancing is in place, maybe gridding of the area as well. And again, we've got a version of a check sheet available. So there's kind of 4 or 5 documents. Any kind of training that's being done with regards to cleaning, safety precautions, emergency action plans, anything like that, make sure that it's all been signed off. So again, some kind of training declaration for all staff to have signed would also be useful. I can again provide that if anybody needs one. So there's 4 or 5 things there that documents that you'd need to think about before allowing staff back.
Okay, thank you. So, can staff bring personal belongings to work?
I'm afraid staff are going to have to bring personal belongings to work to come in. But I think what I would say is let's try and keep it to a minimum. Certainly, you know, if they drive, they've got to be bringing car keys in, winter coats, things like that. But I would say anything that they don't really need in the course of their daily work activity, not to bring in. So what we don't want is loads of magazines hanging around the workplace, personal belongings from home that they don't really need. Medication, obviously, they're going to need to bring in if they're on medication. If you can find lockers or anywhere they can store things so that desks haven't got extra items on, that would be worth doing. And again, I know some businesses are making staff disinfect or spray down things before they allow them into the office or the building or the factory or whatever it might be. So what I would say is try and keep personal belongings to a minimum. And again, whatever they bring in, I would make them take home again at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you. Should we use masks in the office, and should we ask employees to provide their own?
Second part of the question first is no. If you're asking staff to wear masks, you need to provide them. They'd be classified as PPE, personal protective equipment, and every employer needs to provide that should they have seen that there is a risk needed. So they'll be the same as a hard hat or a high-vis jacket, boots, gloves, breathing apparatus, whatever it might be. So if you want to make staff wear them, you need to provide them. I think it's good practice that if you've got staff who are maybe working together or going to see clients or whatever, it's best practice to provide those. Again, I think the first part of the question goes back to your risk assessment, and again, it's picked up, and it really depends whether you can socially distance your staff. So if you think about maybe a factory where you've got maybe a line where maybe things are being picked or sorted or whatever it might be, and staff are only maybe a metre apart, then because of the nature of the operation, they can't socially distance. So gloves and masks would have to be worn. But if we think about maybe a business operation where, and if you think about our office, we've managed to socially distance the office and only allow 4 to 6 people in at any one time. So we're not saying staff have to wear masks. So it goes back to the operation. Look at your business, see if you can socially distance everybody. If you can, you don't have to enforce. But if you can't, it'd be best practice to provide masks and potentially gloves for staff.
Okay, thank you. Just because it's relevant in this section, we've had one supplemental question about the QR code. It says, should an office display the QR code? They are, but it seems to be more for service industries like restaurants and hotels. I guess we're displaying it, aren't we? Yep. And I know we don't have to, but we are displaying it more for visitors, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's just good practice. It's getting people in the mindset that more and more businesses, service providers, leisure, whatever it might be, you're going to see these posters more and more frequently. It adds an extra layer of protection in. So if somebody comes into a business with it and they scan it and they then come into contact with anybody else that's been there, obviously there's an extra layer there. So we've taken the decision to support the NHS app and to support the Public Health England guidelines by doing it. So I think best practice would be that as many businesses that could display the QR code as possible. Hope that answers the question.
So we've also had somebody ask if we can send out all the relevant links. So yes, what we'll do, our follow-up email, we will include all of the links that Dom is referring to or has referred to, and that we may refer to further on in the webinar. So yes, we will send that out. So our last sort of health and safety section question is probably more one for Victoria, if you're there, Victoria.
Yep.
And that's to do with what do we do if somebody refuses to come to work?
Okay. And probably last, but probably complicated, not a straightforward one in terms of how employment law works. So If you have an employee refusing to come to work, then I guess there's a couple of pieces of legislation you need to be mindful of. Firstly, the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations, which requires businesses to make that suitable and sufficient assessment of risks to employees' health and safety. And then there's the Employment Rights Act of '96, where employees are protected when acting to protect their own or others' safety. So an employee has the right not to be subjected to any detriment or to be unfairly dismissed when the employee reasonably believes the danger to be so serious and imminent, and therefore chooses to refuse attending work. So I guess it hinges on this: what do we mean by serious and imminent? And I guess the complexity of COVID makes it a illness where it has the potential to be deemed as a serious and imminent threat in accordance with the Employment Rights Act. And actually, we know from leading barristers that back in the peak of the pandemic, around April, then COVID-19 will most likely to have been deemed as a serious and imminent threat because of the infection levels. And then as the summer progressed and infection levels reduced, it probably was questionable. But that's what an employer needs to be mindful of. So when we deal with claims from employees that they've suffered a detriment or have been unfairly dismissed, then the Employment Rights Act says the employee must show there was circumstances of danger which they reasonably believe to be serious and imminent. And so it won't matter what the employer thought, but it's actually what matters is what the employee reasonably believed at the time they acted, i.e. so they refused to attend work, or they might just walk off site. So if the virus is at a point where it is such that it would be a serious and imminent threat, then because they would have protection under that employment legislation, it would be about how you manage that situation. And so to actually discipline somebody or take that course of action is going to be highly risky. And so it's about finding that middle ground. So the employee saying they feel scared to come to work because of COVID, the infections levels, they think it's a serious and imminent threat. Then from the employer, their response, a reasonable response, would be to allow that time off from the workplace. Now, whether that time off from the workplace is paid or unpaid is another complex area of employment law. I guess the difficulty is we won't actually know for sure until it gets tested in the courts later, probably in 3-4 years' time, because we know there's delays in tribunals, and then obviously you've got the different court levels. So it's going to come down to a decision by the employer as to whether they're going to treat that leave as paid or unpaid. And so perhaps it's a commercial decision as to whether you want to treat it as paid. It's very difficult, as I say, because we don't have that clear direction or steer from employment legislation. But certainly going through any disciplinary process as a way of addressing it would be highly risky. So it's trying to find that time off from the workplace to manage it.
Okay, thank you. Just a supplementary question on that. Does it also relate to people refusing to come in due to public transport? I think we've had this one before, haven't we?
So
I guess the challenge is that the only way they can come in to work? Because we've had a number say, well, they could drive in, and we've arranged kind of car parking spaces so they can drive, so they can avoid. But if the only route is public transport, then it is difficult.
It is difficult, and I think it's going to very much depend on the situation, the circumstances that you've got that you're dealing with. So if there is alternative ways to get in, then actually that's reasonable to expect the employer to find an alternative way to attend work. But if that's their sole way of getting in, then actually and working from home isn't possible, then potentially they're saying that they're refusing to come to work because they don't feel safe, essentially, isn't it?
And that very much depends on what the experience is on the train or the bus or whatever,
Yeah.
whether it is a very busy route and that lots of people are on, and it is potentially high risk. It is down to the individual, isn't it? And what you can discuss and agree with them, understand their concerns, and just see if there is a way of working through it. But you're back to the situation, they perceive it is unsafe. So and it's something out of your control as well. It's not your workplace, it's actually getting to your workplace that is the issue. It's not an easy one.
Not at all.
Okay, let's move on a little bit, because some of the questions that are coming in might actually be covered in our next section.
Okay.
So we're into self-isolation now.
Okay.
So who needs to self-isolate if somebody at work has symptoms and or tests positive for COVID-19?
Okay, so the latest position on this is that if an employee tests positive or has those symptoms, then you know, like Dom said earlier, it's about sending them home, or they don't, you know, come into work. Now, the advice is that that person, you know, if possible, you know, makes people aware that they've been in close contact with, that they let them know that they have these symptoms. In actual fact, self-isolation, what they say is, should occur once the person has been contacted by the NHS test and trace system. So from a workforce point of view, you might have that call in one morning to say, you know, Victoria, I can't come into work because I've got the symptoms. It doesn't necessarily lead to a knee-jerk reaction of then other people in the workplace self-isolating. It's only if they then get contacted by the test and trace system. Or unless, of course, they start developing symptoms. But from a workplace point of view, you would take the measures of carrying out some immediate urgent cleaning of the area where that employee has been at work. And I guess other than being told by the NHS, then, you know, they can carry on being at work following the social distancing measures. They do say that they should take particularly more a cautious approach to social distancing and those measures if in case they then go on to develop symptoms, or if that colleague of theirs goes on to be tested positive. But until they get the alert from test and trace, there's no immediate need to self-isolate.
Okay, thank you. So now we move on to, linked with that, the $6 million question. What are our obligations with pay when our employees have to self-isolate? This is so confusing for everybody, isn't it?
So people have to self-isolate for, they could be part of a household that has symptoms but they don't, or they could have symptoms, or they could be returning from you know, overseas and have to quarantine. So I guess an easier way to think of it is if they themselves have symptoms, then they would be eligible for SSP or any company sick pay. Check obviously your schemes. If they don't have any symptoms, so for example, you know, I'm living with somebody that has the symptoms, I do not, but obviously I can't go to work, it would be unpaid. So that's obviously going to cause challenge for many people, and so it's about working with your employees. If you have that situation, well, can they find a way of mitigating that financial loss by, you know, if they've got some time off in lieu owing to them, have they got any annual leave that perhaps they can take just to soften the blow of that financial you know, issue that comes with it. But essentially, if they don't have symptoms, it's unpaid. If they have symptoms, it would be whether they're eligible for the SSP and company sick pay. But yeah, so I think it gets really challenging because there's so many different scenarios for when people self-isolate. People have to self-isolate before having medical operations and procedures, for example. You know, we've got all these different scenarios, and as I say, I think the easiest thing to have in mind is, does the employee have symptoms, or are they being told to self-isolate because somebody else has? And I think that's the clearest way of remembering it for the moment.
So we've just had a supplement question. So if you're all right to carry on this subject,
Yeah.
If they come back from a country that's been added to the quarantine list.
Okay. Which changes almost daily, it feels like.
It does, doesn't
So
it?
again, if somebody comes back into the UK, they're told to quarantine. It's a legal requirement to quarantine, first of all. And if they're not demonstrating any symptoms, then again, it's unpaid. If they later develop symptoms during that quarantine period, then they may switch then to a SSP scenario, or company sick pay if your terms allow it. But essentially, they come back into the UK, they've got no symptoms, but they, by law, are not allowed to go anywhere, then it's unpaid. But again, it's thinking about the financial loss for that employee, and, you know, can you consider some time off in lieu that maybe you've accumulated, some any more annual leave, but bearing in mind they've already just had a period of annual leave. And obviously you don't want them to use all their holiday in one go, because there's implications for, you know, the rest of the holiday year. They need to have breaks later on. But essentially it's unpaid if they've not got those symptoms, or they're just being told to quarantine.
Okay, thank you. I think that we've covered quite a lot of the questions actually that have come in since, so that's good. Thank you. So, sorry, let's kick on. So one of our employees lives with somebody who is shielding and doesn't want to come into the office. What can we do? There's another common question we get.
Okay, I guess it's similar to the previous one about refusing to work. So just remember that COVID has that potential to be deemed as a dangerous and serious and imminent threat under the Employment Rights Act, and therefore they shouldn't be subject to any detriment or be unfairly dismissed. So in the situation, if your employee is genuinely concerned for the safety of others, their family member, and they hold those reasonable grounds for believing the safety of their family member is at risk, then really attending work, then if they feel it's a risk to them by attending work, then they should remain off. And it's similar to where an employee feels unsafe to come to work and refuses. And again, how you deal with the pay for that is complex. We don't know the definitive answer, whether it should be treated as paid leave or unpaid leave. You could take the commercial decision of treating it as unpaid, but being prepared to have to then pay it when it gets tested in the courts 2-3 years down the line. Or you may make a commercial decision that actually we want to show our support, our care for our employees, and you may consider treating that as paid leave, or a balance between the two. So it will be a commercial decision at this point around the pay, given that we don't know what is actually legally right. But essentially, if the fact that somebody in their household has an extremely serious medical condition that puts them at risk, higher risk of COVID, then that employer will be holding those reasonable grounds, won't they, for feeling that it's unsafe to come to work. I think on the other thing to add, shielding was paused in August, and it is still paused. So technically, we don't have people who are shielding, but nevertheless, that person in the household is extremely vulnerable to the virus, and so I think, you know, the same principles should apply in terms of actually the employee essentially feels it's risky coming to work because of who they live with. And I think perhaps we may see shielding coming back into operation again. We'll see how these latest measures work and how infection levels go, but potentially shielding could come back in. But I think it's allowing that employee to stay off work if they've got that genuine grounds for believing it's unsafe.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, should employers introduce temperature checks as an added precautionary measure?
So it makes sense to, because it is an extra step as a way of protecting everybody and the business, but it is a complex and grey area, and actually it's not really addressed by the government in any of their advice. So at the moment it is down for businesses to decide whether they introduce that. So it does depend pretty much on your business, the roles you have, and as well as the other measures that you've got in place as part of your risk assessment process. But why it's complex is because of the whole, you know, data protection rules, as well as all the you know, human rights and things like that for privacy, and because it's medical data, sensitive personal data. So you are entitled to introduce the measure, but the legal position, I guess, is similar to when you carry out medical testing. Think of it on a par with that when you do that for health reasons. But if you do believe it's necessary because it's identified as part of your risk assessment and you believe it helps mitigate risk, then look at the contract of employment first of all to see if you're entitled to implement it or not, because that's going to be key. Because if you don't have anything in your contract that allows you to undertake medical testing of that nature, then basically it would be unlawful if you're not getting their agreement to it. So have a look at the contract, have a look at your risk assessment, understand whether actually it is a necessary and reasonable proportionate approach to take, and if you feel that it is, because of the nature of the business and the jobs people do, then it's having those conversations with your workforce, setting out why you've come to that conclusion that you want to bring them in, the risks perhaps of not doing it, and seek their consent to introducing it. If you've got it in the contract, then it's about communicating to them that you're introducing them in line with the contract. If you haven't got it in the contract, then you must get their voluntary agreement to do it. But yes, it is, you know, at high level, in general, it seems like it would be a good idea, but you've got to think about the business that you do and the roles that people undertake as to whether it's proportionate and necessary.
Okay.
It's an interesting one.
It is, and I guess a lot of people won't have kind of had the forethought for this one with their contracts, would they? To have the right in the contract.
Oh, no.
and whether you'd put it in now, it's a bit of an interesting one.
Yeah.
Whether you'd put it in for new staff. So yeah, I think it's a lot of people are reviewing their policies, aren't they, around management.
And I think, you know, we've all got responsibility to help eradicate this virus, haven't we? We all want to get rid of it and move on. And so, you know, you'd like to think that I appreciate it's personal data, it's, you know, medical information about somebody, but if you could be assured by an employer about the safekeeping of any information, that there's a genuine need for it and it will help, you know, hopefully people would be in agreement to it, you know, because we, as I say, we all just want to get rid of this virus, don't we?
We do, quite.
Desperately.
So, new stuff as it keeps coming in, keeps challenging us, doesn't it? Keeping us on our toes. So how will the new self-isolation regulations work?
Okay, so what we know, and they have only been live since I think midnight on the 28th of September. So it will now be, or is now, an offence if an employer knowingly permits a worker to attend any place other than where they're meant to be self-isolating. And there can be fines for the employer, which start at £1,000. So that's from the employer's perspective. But not only does the employer have responsibility, but it's actually made it for an employee to have a responsibility as well, in that they must notify their employer when they've been requested to self-isolate. And if they don't, it's a separate criminal offence for them if they fail to do so. So it's really, really sort of coming down hard on, I guess, people's right, isn't it, and of how they live, but they've got to notify their employers, and employers must not knowingly employ or allow people anywhere other than where they're meant to self-isolate. Which is why I said at the start of the webinar that I think we're going to see more and more absences from work, because we've got the legal implications of this, and we now have the test and trace system, so people are going to be alerted if they've been in contact, close contact with people that have got tested positive. So whereas before, I think perhaps people may have chosen not chosen to not self-isolate because there wasn't any implications of not doing so, and obviously they couldn't afford to not go to work, I think things will be different now and we will see more absences.
Okay, thank you. So, should we get employees to sign any declaration on returning to work? I think we've covered it similar one with Dom, but
yeah, so following on from what Don was saying earlier, I think it would be a useful practical step, especially now we've got the legislation in place that makes it an offence for an employer to allow somebody to work when they've been told they have to self-isolate. So I just think it's an extra protection for business to have some kind of declaration that employees complete before coming into work, just to evidence, and it's just that extra measure they put in place. And it's just verifying they've not been in contact with somebody that's been had symptoms or tested positive. They've not been notified by Test and Trace.
Yeah. And we have got a form if anybody wants one, so do contact us afterwards and we can send you one.
Okay.
So next topic, absenteeism.
Okay. Yeah.
So
okay.
First of all, pay. Do we pay them if they're absent from work because of having to quarantine, and can we change our holiday process to restrict overseas holidays?
Interesting one. And can I just apologise if anybody can hear any background noise, because the the workmen in the garden have suddenly got the machinery on. So I do apologise. Okay, this is an interesting one, and I've sort of touched on this before. So do you have to pay your employees? No, unless they've got the symptoms. So if they've gone abroad and they're coming back and their country then becomes one that they have to quarantine for, well, quarantining is a legal requirement. They can't come back in until after the 14 days, and therefore that leave is treated as unpaid. Unless they go on to develop symptoms, then they may switch to some kind of SSP or any company sick pay. In terms of changing your holiday process to restrict overseas, then even temporarily restricting employees from travelling overseas, then just be careful, as it's basically unilaterally changing terms and conditions, which could amount to or would amount to a breach of contract. Clearly, you've got an argument to say that because of the impact on the business of having to quarantine on returning from holiday, it prevents them from returning to work. If you want to introduce a temporary ban, but you need to get that agreement to making such fundamental changes. The other thing to be mindful of, there could be some discriminatory issues perhaps if that rule means that certain nationalities who wish to visit relatives may be disproportionately affected perhaps. So I think it could be quite difficult to introduce. I think if you do seriously want to think about it, then it's about talking to your employees, explaining it and the risks. But I think it does come with risk because of changing that policy rule.
Yeah.
But there is potentially an argument for it. It's just how you go about it.
Yeah, I think it's down to the business reason, isn't it? As always in these things, it's if you've got a strong business case for needing to enforce that rule, then you should be okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the thing is it would be no pay, so it is to their detriment as well. So if they are prepared to take that risk to have their holiday, then it isn't costing you potentially.
And in terms of restricting overseas business trips, and that's very different because obviously clearly it's a work event and you've got that duty of care, so you are able to restrict your staff from carrying out overseas business trips, but you just got to tread carefully about anything of a personal nature.
Yeah. So if, on the same sort of theme, if the country they're travelling to isn't on the list at the time of travel, but gets added while they're out there, which has happened to lots of people, I think, what are the implications for that?
Yeah. So really, I think there's a lot of responsibility that should be placed on your employee. They should be keeping up to date, you know, on the current situation, not just before they travel, but whilst actually they're away, and also coming back en route back, because things are changing daily, really frequently, and so there must be some responsibility on the employee's part to just take responsible for that. I would advise perhaps that before the employee goes on leave, then having that conversation with them about your expectations, especially that there's a legal requirement to quarantine, so there's no way out of it. Once you get back, you have to, by law, quarantine. Even if they were to get a test, for example, and it comes back negative, they still have to quarantine for the full duration. So let them know it's their responsibility for keeping up to date in your conversation, and that they must notify you within 24 hours of any change, or as soon as you know they have that change, because you essentially need to know how to plan for their absence. And also they need to know about how you're going to deem or treat that absence in terms of pay, or if they have the ability to work from home, then have a conversation about whether that needs to happen if they come back. And so I think it's important having that conversation and following up in writing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. One of the questions we had was, what happens if they won't tell you where they're going on holiday? We've kind of got around that, haven't we? With we drafted a letter for our clients to use, which kind of they have to set when they book their leave. It basically sets out, so it makes it harder for the employee not to declare, and it sets out if you go abroad, this is what will happen if you. Is that right? I mean, would you agree?
Yeah,
That's kind of how to get around that.
But yeah, I mean, if employees are refusing, then
sorry,
there's an impact, isn't there? I mean, we've all got to take the personal responsibility, haven't we? And you know, hopefully we don't see that situation crop up. By law, they've got to quarantine. It's not us requiring it, or it's not an optional choice that the government is suggesting. So I think having that conversation before somebody is traveling overseas, you know, reminding them that actually it's a legal requirement. It's not just something that we're enforcing, or you know, you can choose to do, you have to do it. And you know, the list changes frequently, doesn't it? So they need to keep up to date.
Absolutely. Okay, so the next question is, can the company refuse employees who ask to carry annual leave over that they didn't take because they couldn't travel abroad? This is happening a lot, isn't it?
So can the company refuse employees who ask to carry out? So we know that earlier this year, gosh, when back in March, April time, the government brought in legislation basically that allows employees, to be able to carry over any holiday they've not been able to take due to COVID into the next 2 years. So I guess we've got that as a basis to be mindful of. They have the right to carry over if they've not been able to take it because of COVID. So I'm assuming then in this question they've not been able to travel abroad because of COVID, and therefore they can take that holiday at some other point into a 2-year period. But then you've also got, as with any holiday requests and booking process, employers can decline holidays anyway. So as long as you know, if there's business grounds as to why that person can't go on holiday at a certain point next year, then it's your normal holiday booking processes that you would follow. But in principle, you can't refuse them to be carrying over their holiday in the 2-year period, or allow them to take it at a later date. But you're entitled to refuse if it would be a detriment to the business at this particular point in time, but they should be able to take it over the next 2 years.
And I think it's statutory leave, isn't it? That
it's
relates
statutory
to
only,
the statutory level. So if you do award, you know, additional enhanced leave entitlements, then you can dictate what happens over the additional leave. But for their statutory leave, if they haven't taken their minimum entitlement, then you wouldn't be able to restrict it.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is, how do we manage our absence procedures when an employee has COVID?
Okay, so the absence procedures would be the same. They carry on as normal. So notification procedures followed, and because I suppose at the start of the absence, you know how long it's going to be for. You don't need to ask them to update you daily necessarily, just to keep you posted during that isolation period. Of course, if they're isolating, they've got symptoms but it's not yet tested or proven if it is or not, then you would want them to at least let you know any developments, because if there's any implications for other people at work, and also just from a welfare supportive perspective. And record keeping should stay the same, so in terms of the self-certification, as well as obviously they get their instruction to self-isolate from the NHS. So you've got that document. In terms of absence triggers and your more formal process, then this is probably an area where I would say adapt, because of the pandemic. Everybody is affected by the pandemic, and so it would be reasonable and fair to exclude any COVID-related absences from your usual trigger system, i.e. don't count them towards the numbers that would trigger a formal meeting. I think given what we're dealing with, it's only fair and right that we adapt that and just take those out from the counting the triggers. But everything else to do with your absence process, absolutely keep in, and we've still got that welfare and duty of care responsibility to make sure they're okay and check in with them.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to the next section. So we have been 1 or 2 extra questions, and we'll try and cover them at the end, depending on how much time we have, but we may have to come back to you directly. So don't worry, we will respond. So just a little bit on financial support. So the first one is we've got the furlough scheme. Will we be entitled to further funds through the new job scheme if they've had financial support by the furlough scheme? I assume that's what they mean.
Yeah, so
yeah.
The job support scheme was launched, was it a week ago or the week before last? I can't remember now. It all,
I don't know.
there's so many things. The Chancellor basically confirmed that it doesn't matter if you've received grants through the furlough scheme, you can still apply for funds through the new job support scheme that's going to be implemented. So that's fine. So you can get further funds, as long as the employee works at least 33% of their usual hours for the first 3 months. They're saying 3 months because I think what the government is going to do is review that 33% level, whether they need to adapt it. But certainly, as long as they work that 33% of their usual hours and they're on your PAYE on or before, I think, the 23rd of September, then all SMEs will be able to apply. For larger organisations, though, they may be eligible for it, but it's going to be determined by their turnover to see specifically how much of a turnover they've lost as a result of the COVID pandemic. So it sounds like it's automatic for SMEs, but for the larger organisations there will be eligibility criteria for that, and it won't matter if you've previously received the job retention funds through the furlough scheme.
Okay. Thank you. So then nicely leads into how will the new job support scheme work? What we know,
well,
anyway.
we're still getting our own heads around this because it's new. There was a little bit of confusion on launch day. I don't know if anybody follows these things on Twitter and all sorts, but there was some confusion. But what we understand it to mean is that for the hours that the employee does not work, then the pay for that time will be covered by the government, the employer, and the employee. So we're all taking responsibility for those that lost pay. So the government will pay 1/3, the employer will pay 1/3, and for that final third, the employee will be accepting no pay. So that's their contribution to this, I guess, scheme, if you like. So the government's trying to ensure that that financial burden of the hours that aren't worked, the pay that's not been received, they're trying to share the burden equally amongst the government, the employer, and the individual. And there will be a cap to the amount that the government contribute, which I think £697 per month. But yes, so those hours that aren't worked, the pay that won't be received will be split, and the employer will take an element of it unpaid.
Okay, thank you.
And we are going to get more details actually in later on in the autumn about that, I believe.
Hopefully soon, because it starts
Hopefully
the 1st of
soon.
November, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think they implied it would be follow on from the furlough, didn't they?
Yeah.
So that it would be the 1st of November, but they're leaving it very late to let us have detail
Yeah.
and for us to create appropriate letters and agreements. So
yeah, but we
yeah.
do yeah, we are keeping our eyes open and
we'll let you know. Yeah. So okay, so will holiday entitlement reduce if days worked are reduced under the job support scheme?
Okay, so that's an interesting one, and we haven't got the answer for written down, and so we don't have that clarity. I guess there will be some conflicting thoughts around this. So my take on it was that in theory, then if you prorata holiday, then the employee potentially is being penalised twice. Firstly, because they're taking a pay cut, and secondly, they're having their holiday entitlement reduced. However, but having said that, the working time regulations, obviously annual leave is about rewarding or giving employees time off from work for rest periods for the hours that they've worked, and therefore they would be getting, if they didn't prorata it, they would be getting excessive holiday back for actually what they've worked. And I think this is probably so the whole furlough thing, if we think about that, there was a lot of trying to work out how the regulations worked alongside of the employment legislation, and I think this is probably going to need further clarity because we don't know essentially. Because you know, there is the issue of the employee working less for the employer, and then at some point the employer's having to give the full amount of holiday. Well, that's not fair either. So I think it will be one for the legal profession to work out how it will work alongside the different pieces of legislation. So I don't have an answer, but I guess they're my thoughts.
Yeah. You're right. It'll probably be divided as well when it first comes out, and then they'll revise it, and then we'll finally get the decision, hopefully soon.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like anything. All the different issues that this raises have not yet been clarified for us. So we will keep a watching brief for you. So the next thing is about how can you claim for the job retention bonus. So they did provide some information on this recently, didn't they?
Yeah, probably a couple of weeks back, maybe longer. As I said, time merges. But so the job retention bonus is linked to your furlough scheme. So what we know is that actually you can't make any claim yet until the 15th of Feb. I guess they're still working on the online portal, and further information will come out around how you do that. But essentially, you can claim from the 15th of Feb. You'll be able to claim for your employees that you were able to make an eligible claim for under the coronavirus job retention scheme, i.e. furlough, that you've kept continuously employed from the end of that claim period of your last furlough scheme claim up until the 31st of January next year. And then you'll be able to make a claim for the bonus so long as the employees aren't serving a contractual or statutory notice on the 31st of Jan. And that includes people that are serving notice of retirement. And then there's also a threshold as well in terms of pay. So they must have been paid enough in each of the relevant tax months, which I think are November, December, January, in order to meet it. So there are a few qualifying rules around it, but essentially further information will come out, but the claim will be able to be submitted from the 15th of February next year.
Okay, thank you. So now we move on to recruitment. So slightly different side of things. We are getting people who are recruiting at the moment, thankfully, at the moment, as well as everything else. So Kickstart, how and when do we apply for grants under the Kickstart scheme?
Okay, well, you can apply now for the grants. They are saying that realistically, given it takes about a month to process the applications and to be reviewed, realistically, the recruitment side of it will probably be November onwards. So the application, as I say, can start now. You may or may not know, but you have to do an application for at least 30 placements. So if you're an employer that doesn't need 30 Kickstart placements, then you are required to join up with other similar employers or local authorities, trade bodies, in order to put one application in that covers for all of you. Employers can also contact the local job centre for help on getting a representative. So you have one person that is responsible for processing it. And if you're based in Northamptonshire and are interested in the scheme, then I do believe that we are ourselves in discussions with a local representative to see if they'll take on referrals from us. So there's a little bit of organising and administering of getting an application through, but essentially once your application is submitted, then it will be sent off to a panel to review, and then they commit to giving a response within that 1 month, which is why I said recruitment is probably realistically going to be November. And it'll be for each employer to assess the applicants as to which one gets the post. And then the applicants will be directed to yourselves from the job centre, because they need to be on universal credit.
Yeah. So I think that answers the next question, doesn't it? Which is, how do they get selected for the placement? So the applications come through your, is it work advisor or something you're appointed when you've been on a long-term unemployment benefit?
Yeah, I think the individuals, I need to double check now, either through the job centre or the individuals themselves get referred, obviously, but it's the employer that actually is responsible for setting up the selection process. Yeah, and things like assessment centres, for example, are probably quite good because they're good for assessing a volume of people. And if you're going to get a volume of applications, you can see each other in one go and can equally, assess everybody together. So it's for the employer to select through whichever means that they want to do that.
And bearing in mind that the majority of these are going to be people potentially straight out of school or college or university, and with potentially not a lot of skills in the area that you're recruiting for, which is, so it's good to kind of assess on that basis.
Yeah, and assessment centres are good for assessing teamwork, communication skills, listening, delegation. If you have a team activity, who takes a lead role in that naturally, and assessment centres are good for those behaviours. And just if you do also include some kind of interviewing selection process, then perhaps your competency-based interviews, but think about your skills are transferable. So people have been to university, they've had to complete dissertations, they've had to do time management, planning and organising. People that have in the sixth form, any voluntary work, they're all really good transferable skills that you can bring over to the working world. So use examples from when they've been in the sixth form at university, at college, or undertaking voluntary work. But yeah, so it's for an employer to determine how they select. Yeah.
And then do you need a contract of employment for somebody joining on the Kickstart scheme?
Yes.
And what employment rights would they have? So this is actually quite complex, wasn't it, when you started looking at, we are looking at drafting one, or have drafted one ready for this scheme, but it's surprising how much is needed, isn't it?
Yeah, because they will be an employee, albeit for a defined period. So it's like any other fixed term, I guess, isn't it? So, if, using the principles of a fixed term contract, so it's dedicated specifically for the 6-month placement. And so it comes to an end after that 6 months. But things like, rights to, annual leave, all that kind of stuff, they get treated exactly the same as any other permanent employee. They will be an employee of yours. and so should get a contract of employment setting out the terms.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have one final question for today, because we have run out of time. So it's an interesting one. It didn't fit naturally into just one category, as it crossed a few, I think. So we had one about productivity for an employee working from home has dropped. They are back in the office but have requested to work from home again. How do we manage this? Do we agree a trial period, although they are a key worker in financial services and it works better for all the team to be working in the office?
Interesting.
Mm.
So working from home, productivity is dropped when they work from home. Okay, so they're asking to work from home. So if you're if you're dealing with a flexible working request, as you know, under the regulations, and of course there are a certain number of reasons why you can decline, and they've got to be the recognised ones by law, and you can decline a request if there's a detrimental impact on performance. But the thing is, it's obviously I don't know too much of the circumstances, and so it's a little bit hard. But if the underperformance has never been discussed with that employee, then it's very difficult to sort of use that as reasoning as to why you would say performance would suffer. So I think a trial period is a good way forward, because actually you can monitor it over the 1 month, 2 months, which however long you're going to agree to trial it for, and you can meet regularly through that trial period. Both parties feed into the process. Then when you come to the end of the trial period to make a decision as to whether it's going to become permanent or not, you've got that really good foundation, that data to sort of report as to actually whether it's going to work or not, and if there's any performance issues. If I suppose that without knowing too much of the case, it's a little bit difficult. But yeah, I mean, you can decline if there's performance issues, if there's going to be a detriment to performance. But as I say, if it's not been raised up to now, it may be for the trial period as a way forward to sort of work out whether it will work or not. But very interesting.
Yeah.
And even if they perform really well during that trial period, and then it gets confirmed, and then you see it drop. Well, performance is like, as you would deal with it any other way. You've got a right and entitlement to pick up underperformance, through your informal approach first, before obviously you got the opportunity to use formal procedures. But I think the trial period on that scenario seems a good way forward.
Good idea. Yeah, I'd agree. Okay, so just before we close the webinar, I've just got a couple of things where we might be able to help you. The first thing is an invitation. So we're all facing challenges, different challenges, as we found with our poll at the beginning and throughout the questions that we've had throughout the webinar, that we're all facing in the next 12 months. And we invite you to become part of our research. We're doing this in conjunction with Deloitte, and we invite you to take a short survey, which is about your experiences and your challenges. And then if you do participate, you will get a copy of our report at the end. So, so we invite you to take part in the survey and help us to be part of research into this and into the challenges, and so that we can also look at ways that we can support you and help you manage through this. The other thing that we can offer you is that Dom can also help with some first aiders for mental health training, which leads to a genuine qualification. So if you have staff interested in becoming mental health first aiders, then we can help you with that training. We also work with a number of partners who can help us with employee benefits, and one of them is employee assistance programs, which has become a very popular additional benefit during lockdown, and particularly as we're trying to return to the workplace with all the different challenges employees are facing. And we also have a sort of employee engagement tool, which has a free trial, which is really good. You set your benchmarks, it's all part of the free trial, and you have your first survey free, and then if you wish, you can sign up to take it forward and do regular surveys to measure your progress with employee engagement, and it gives you a number of actions that you can follow or implement following your employee comments and suggestions. And finally, you know, if you do need some help with looking at the future restructuring or resource planning or whatever it might be, then we can help you with this. So do talk to us if you need some help. And as always, you know, sign up for our newsletters if you want to be kept in the loop and be notified about things as they change, as they happen. And we also have an ongoing webinar program. We've added a couple more into there. So as I've just mentioned, we're looking one of our partners is introducing building a great employee benefits package without breaking the bank. That's a new one we've added. He can help talk through all the different options available to you, and which might help with your employee engagement and also supporting them with things such as the mental health and their health and well-being while working through this ongoing situation. And we've got a health and safety at work statutory compliance webinar coming up with Dom conducting that one, as well as the regular monthly slots, the Brexit one, which is extremely popular, and the right to work and new immigration points-based system. So lots going on. There will probably be one or two more that will be added as we work through. So we haven't even looked at November's programme yet, trying to keep up with what's going on now. As always, we welcome your feedback, so do let us know, and if you have any further suggestions of topics you'd like us to cover, please do let us know. And finally, I want to say thank you to Dom, thank you to Victoria for putting yourselves on the spot here and answering all these questions, and also thank you to you all for attending and sticking through with us. As apologies, it has run over somewhat this time. A copy of the presentation and also a link to the recording will be sent to you shortly as soon as we've managed to process everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.